Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm LAURIE GAYLOR.
And I'm Dan Barker. LAURIE and I are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this program. FFRF is a national nonprofit association with a membership of more than 30,000 secular members, mainly atheists and agnostics, working to keep state and church separate.
We invite you to join FFRF or ask for information at ffrf.org.
Many colleges have a Department of Religious Studies, but have you ever heard of a Department of Secular Studies? Our guest today is a pioneer in secular studies, and he's one of the world experts on secularity.
And he'll tell us what that word means. Phil Zuckerman has been professor of sociology at Pitzer College in Claremont, California for more than 20 years and is a professor of secular studies. He's also got a fascinating connection with Hollywood, which he'll tell us about in a few minutes.
Phil Zuckerman has written many books, including Society Without God, What the Least Religious Nations Can Tell Us About Contentment, Living the Secular Life, Faith No More, Why People Reject Religion, The Non-Religious, and the 2-volume Atheism and Secularity.
Phil wrote the popular textbook Invitation to the Sociology of Religion, and with John Shook edited the Oxford Handbook of Secularism.
And he just keeps writing. Phil Zuckerman's newest book, just out this fall, is called What It Means to Be Moral. So Phil Zuckerman, welcome to Freethought Matters.
Thank you so much. Thrilled to be here.
So what is secularity?
The state of being non-religious. It just, we talk about religion, the belief, behavior, belonging. So a secular person would be someone that lacks supernatural beliefs, doesn't engage in religious rituals or practices or prayer or church attendance, and doesn't belong to a religion. So secular is sort of an adjective, and secularity would sort of be the noun of that. But the reason I coined that term or popularized it, I don't know who coined it, was simply to capture the lived experience of being non-religious and what that means. How do we live our lives? How do we raise our kids? How do we vote? That kind of thing.
So you are also a pioneer in secular studies. And am I right that Pitzer College is the only college that offers a degree in secular studies?
That's right. That's right. In 2011, we created the first secular studies program in the nation. And the idea there was more and more humans are becoming secular. It's a huge chunk of humanity, right? And it's important to study religion and religious history and religious thought and religious texts, but there's a history of secularity too, going back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, ancient India, ancient China, and that history just really isn't talked about. Secular people engage in politics. Secular people are a presence in many societies. In some societies, they're the majority. You know, you look at Scotland, 72% of the population is secular, and there was no academic home to talk about secular people, secular movements, secular culture, secular history. So I was thrilled to be able to create that department with some of my colleagues, and students can major in secular studies, and they can take classes in various aspects of secular studies, and it's been really fun, really exciting.
Your book, Society Without God, talks a lot about Denmark, for example, where a very small percentage actually believe in God, although they might get married in the church and be culturally religious.
That's correct.
But secular studies, then, it sounds from what you're saying, is like an interdisciplinary, department where you bring in philosophy and history and anthropology, maybe?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Oh, love it. I mean, anthropology for sure. Looking at secular rituals, secular cultures beyond the Western world. For example, that great book, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes.
Yeah.
I forget,
Yeah, Daniel Everett.
Yeah, where he studies, here's a culture.
A linguist.
In the depths of the Amazon that has no sense of a god or messiahs or even supernatural entities at all. And, their stories have just not been told. So definitely interdisciplinary. We have political scientists looking at how, you can't really understand, for example, contemporary India right now or Turkey right now or even the United States if you don't understand how secularism plays plays a role in our political discourse, in the laws that we live under. So yes, it's a little bit of political science, a little bit of sociology, philosophy, like I said, history. I'm teaching a new class on African American humanism, but there was just no, like I said, there was no academic space or home. No, now we have conferences where we meet once a year to share our research. We have 2 new journals where we publish peer-reviewed research, and it's quite exciting.
Well, it is. It's about time.
Yeah.
Now, for someone who doesn't know how burgeoning the population is of seculars, can you tell us worldwide and in the United States, what kind of statistics are we looking at?
So I guess I'll start in the U.S. I'm 50 years old, so when I was born, about 4% of the U.S. population would check non-religious when asked, what is your religion? That's gone up dramatically so that today it's roughly around 26, 28% nationally of Americans saying that they're non-religious. And just to give you a sense of the scale, only about 2% of Americans are Jewish, for example. So
1% Muslim.
That's right. So
and yet they are really considered a very important minority whose rights have to be honored.
Absolutely.
And yet there's really no attention to
That's right.
non-religious.
You'll always hear politicians talking about, when they talk about diversity or being mindful of other religions, they'll talk about Jews, they'll talk about Muslims or even Buddhists, and yet we're almost 30% of the U.S. population as non-religious. When you just look at those in their 20s, it's almost 40%. So that's in the U.S. So we're talking hundreds of, tens of millions in the United States.
Now, before we talk about internationally, can we clarify, not all of those, what we call nuns, N-O-N-E-S, or seculars, identify necessarily as atheist or agnostic. They say they're not religious.
That's correct. So you have within that, let's just say 28, 30% of Americans who identify as having no religion. About, I would say, from the American Religious Identification Survey, about a quarter would be atheist in orientation, another quarter would be agnostic, so about half are atheists or agnostics in orientation. Then you got about 25% who say they believe in something, something bigger, some force, something out there. And then about a quarter would say, yeah, I do believe in God, however they define that God. But what we know from our statistics and our surveys is people are very reluctant to identify as atheists in label or name. However, they might be atheists in orientation. They just don't like the label.
They don't go to church. They don't want to.
Or they don't even believe in God, but they just don't like that word atheist because it has a stigma. So you could look at one survey and you could ask a person, do you believe in God? Yes, no, I don't know. They'll say no. 3 questions down, you can say, are you an atheist? And only about a third will say yes, right in the same survey.
And that is the definition of atheism.
Exactly. And just quickly, Will Gervais, who's a social psychologist at the University of Kentucky, he's doing this really, really interesting research to tease this out. By his estimates, 25% of the U.S. population is actually atheist in orientation. And he does this through sort of sophisticated questioning where you make it so people get to pick and choose things they agree with and don't agree with, but you don't have to know which one, and you put God in there. And anyway.
So lowercase a atheist, not necessarily
Correct.
Uppercase labeling themselves, I am an atheist.
Exactly.
But their daily lives are no different from your and mine.
They lack a belief in a deity. Absolutely.
When I was a Christian...
But what about internationally? Because we left one hanging.
Internationally, the rates are exploding in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Europe is basically post-Christian right now. In the UK, you have more than half the population being secular. In the Netherlands, Estonia, Czech Republic, and Norway, you have more atheists and agnostics than believers. And then Japan, religion is plummeting. You have very strong, huge populations in China, in Vietnam. South Korea is a majority secular. Africa is even seeing some growth in Botswana, in South Africa. I've even seen some numbers in Kenya. So the Middle East is seeing an explosion of, you often can't, in the Arab world, you can't come out necessarily unless you risk arrest and torture, but you're seeing more movement on the internet and Facebook. So in most countries around the world, with very few exceptions, secularity is on the rise. South America, it's booming. Uruguay, Chile, Argentina have more secular people than ever before. So it's in the hundreds of millions, and right now they say about 16% of the global population is non-religious worldwide, which is huge.
So what you're saying is we need to flip the perspective. When I was a preacher, I used to think non-religious people were outsiders. Everybody's pretty much religious, but there's these few outsiders. But that's not so true anymore, is it, in the world?
In some parts, it still is the case, but in more and more societies, it's actually just the opposite. Now, being non-religious is kind of the norm, and it's the believers who are in the minority.
And just briefly before we go out for the break, there are some surprising statistics about comparisons that statistics you've amassed and studied about non-religious cultures versus religious cultures. Very surprising in terms of crime, other issues.
Yeah, that was the biggie for me, just very quickly, that on any measure of societal well-being and health, so crime rates, murder rates, infant mortality rates, poverty rates, obesity rates, alcohol, domestic violence, you name it, child abuse, illiteracy, overwhelmingly the correlation shows that the more secular the society is, the healthier it is, the less crime, the less violence, the better educated, the better well-being for mothers and children, and the more religious the society is, the worse in terms of crime, murder rates, homicide rates. Now, that's not necessarily because of secularity and religion. There's a whole host of other reasons: economics, politics, history, culture, but that's the point. God doesn't seem to have any role in it. It's not a spiritual issue. It's not helping you. It's not a faith issue. It's not helping you. If anything, it's not. They're doing worse. So I'm really trying to always hammer that and beat that drum and say, wait a minute. And we see it all the time, just with mass shootings in this country, where the Mike Huckabees get up there and say, oh, it's because we don't worship God enough. That's why our children are being slaughtered. When in fact the statistics show that's simply not the case. That the least godful nations on earth have the lowest crime rates and gun violent rates.
What I like about you is that you're not just talking philosophy or what you believe. You're talking data and statistics. I mean, you're going to the actual numbers and the actual studies.
That's what I try to do. Absolutely. We got to have some. I'm an empiricist. I want to see what's really going on out there.
So before we wind up this segment, what about the states, blue states versus red states?
Oh, thank you. So that's another thing. Yeah, the Pew Religious Landscape Survey allows us to see which states, even counties actually, you can do it at the county level, are the most church attending and the most God-believing, and which are the least. And the correlations still hold. You can look at the 10 most God-believing church attending states in the United States, which tend to be in the South, and you can look at the most secular states, which tend to be in the Northwest and the Northeast, and the indicators of societal well-being, the same thing. Lower murder rates, lower poverty rates, everything still correlates where the most secular states are doing the best, the most religious states are suffering the worst.
So my question is, and this is a rhetorical question, why does non-belief get such a bad rap? I mean, how unfair.
I agree. I have a theory, but we can get into that.
We'll get to that. So when we come back, we're going to be asking our guest, secular expert and sociology professor Phil Zuckerman, about what it means to be moral. And we're also going to ask you, Phil, to divulge who your famous mother is and that connection to Hollywood.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned for more Freethought Matters.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist, and I'm alarmed by the intrusions of religion into our secular government. That's why I'm asking you to support the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics, working to keep state and church separate, just like our founding fathers intended. Please support the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
I'm Patrick, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. 9 years ago, I saw Dan Barker debate Christian apologists at the University of Wisconsin. They were discussing the resurrection of Jesus and whether or not it was true. At the time, I was Catholic and was very convinced Dan was wrong and that, in fact, the story was true. That debate prompted me to take a course on early Christian literature, and I, in fact, learned more and question my own beliefs. The more I read and the more I learned, the more I came to realize that I was being pretty much intellectually dishonest. Fast forward to 9 years later, I'm now an employee at FFRF and work for the vital mission of separation of state and church. I'm proud to be an out-of-the-closet atheist.
And welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with sociologist and professor of secular studies, Phil Zuckerman, who's written many books on comparative secularism and now has a book just out called What It Means to Be Moral. But before that, we promised you that before we go into more details about facts and statistics, we want to digress for a minute to talk about your famous mother who was Gidget.
Yes.
So,
Now, not everybody who is watching this is going to remember, but
Yeah.
Gidget is famous, so tell us more.
My mom in Malibu when she was a teenager in the late 1950s hung out with a bunch of surf bums on the beach, and they nicknamed her Gidget, which was a conflation of girl and midget. She's very short. She's about 5'1", I think, and she was one of the first women surfers, and she surfed for several summers, and her father was a writer, my grandfather, and he wrote a best-selling book called Gidget about her exploits, which then prompted a movie starring Sandra Dee, led to a TV series with Sally Fields. So that's my mom, and Surfer Magazine ranked her as the 7th most influential surfer of all time. I was very proud of that.
she's still alive?
She's still alive. She's about, I think, 78 now, and still goes down to the beach every day. She doesn't surf anymore, but she walks, and I think she sometimes goes in the water. And she's still friends with some of the old surf guys, and they get together, and she hangs out in Malibu all the time.
I hope there's still some royalties coming in.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I remember Gidget was a very happy, positive, easygoing, optimistic kind of person, and you seem to have inherited that
thank
same
you.
idea. You just seem to enjoy life.
I do.
And you don't believe in God. I mean, how can that be?
That's
And now,
right.
So that brings us to how can you be moral if you don't believe in a God? And that's the topic of your new book.
Yeah.
What it means to be moral.
Absolutely. That's the question always. There's this association that religion equals morality, belief in God equals morality, and that always, of course, the statistics don't hold that up, right? We see that atheists and agnostics are actually underrepresented in prisons around the world, and I just knew when I compared societies and states that religiosity did not boost morality and secularity did not destroy it. In fact, just the opposite. So I actually try to make the claim that God belief actually is destructive of morality. It actually hinders full, mature, ethical development. And in fact, only a secularity can lead us to a more moral social life and even a more moral personal life. Absolutely.
So how does that God belief hinder true morality?
Well, it basically in 4 ways. If morality comes from God and is dependent on God, we got 4 problems, right? Number 1, there's no evidence or proof that God exists. So just start there. So we're basing our morality on a house of air,
An
right?
abstraction.
Right. Then even if we say, okay, let's say there's definitive empirical proof that God exists, that makes the problem worse because no one can agree or understand on what God asks, requires, or commands. We're all, we don't get an updated email every morning telling us. So now everybody's got a different interpretation, right? Slave owners and abolitionists both citing the same text, right?
As Abraham Lincoln pointed out.
Yeah. So then even if we all did get an updated list of moral commandments from God every morning, that makes the problem even worse because that reduces morality to obedience. Now we are just simply following orders. We are just obeying. Obedience is not morality. My dog can obey a lot of commands. It doesn't make her moral. And then even if we all accept that, yes, we'll just obey these commands, it doesn't make it moral, as the Euthyphro dilemma by Plato discussing Socrates shows. All it says is that God issues commands. What makes them moral is suddenly a tautology. So
Yes.
I would argue, and then
It's moral because God instructed it.
Exactly. And then finally, of course, at the end of the day, if you're just doing things to get a reward and avoid punishment, you're acting out of fear. It's childish. It's infantilizing. So I would actually argue that any morality based on God is destructive towards human betterment, human maturity, and ethical fulfillment. What we have to have is what secularity offers, which is a morality based on empathy, compassion, alleviating the suffering of others, fighting for justice and well-being, and
reality.
Living in reality. It's one of the cardinal
consequences
virtues
of our actions.
Absolutely.
What a
having
concept.
conscience.
What a concept.
And that actually improves life, and we see that through history. When people base their morality on things like reason, rationality, empirical evidence for what improves life, life gets better.
So instead of the 10 Commandments, which you show are inadequate for morality, and the biblical teachings, which are actually immoral, you propose, what do you call them, 7 secular...
I talk about these secular virtues that basically secular culture actually embodies and manifests many virtues that lead towards a more ethical life, personally and societally. Things like living in reality. I mean, reality can be harsh, but there's no substitute for confronting it head on and doing what we can to make things better. Motivations driven by compassion and empathy, not fear of punishment, but looking at the suffering of others, understanding it, and wanting to ease it, right? And there's many such virtues. For example, the virtue of free thought. The ability to think and understand and delve into anything and everything, because that's what we are meant to do here. An emphasis on living in the here and now. I mean, these are things
and caring about the here and now rather than some unknowable afterlife.
That's right. This is
which I
it.
think is so harmful.
It's yeah, I agree.
Even heaven is such a. We think of hell as being creating a lot of neuroses and being a bad negative thing.
Right.
But if you believe that if you take out people for your religion, you're going to get 72 virgins.
That's
or
right.
you believe your child who could be saved by medicine, but your faith healing will have a better life in heaven, then heaven is a very dangerous idea.
I absolutely agree. Anyway, you bet, you bet. And so many people in this world who are suffering, who turn to religion for comfort, I understand that. But I often wish that all the time and effort and psychological energy they devote towards worrying about heaven, if they could devote that into making the world a better place, getting better health care for themselves and their families, and creating more equitable and fair legal systems. I mean, that would really what we need to be doing.
Making this world more heavenly.
That's right.
As we like to say.
And another of your secular virtues or values that you point out is empiricism, the scientific method.
That's right.
Instead of just having opinions and feelings, what actually works? What is the actual scientific
That's
outcome,
exactly right. That's absolutely right. And I mean, if you think about it, every improvement we've been able to put into place, improvement in terms of communication, healthcare, transportation, it's all been through the scientific method. It's never been through hope or wishing or praying. It's good old-fashioned testing hypotheses, looking at the evidence in an unbiased way. I mean, I always like, even our ability to, how many times throughout history people prayed to cure deafness and prayed and prayed and prayed. Now we figured out how it works, and we are able to improve people's hearing through the scientific method. And looking at the data is so important. For example, we know that harsh sentencing doesn't cure or make people better when they come out of horrible prison conditions where they are tortured and where they suffer. They don't come out better people, more humane.
Citizens.
And so we have over 75% recidivism rate in the United States. We bring in people who commit crimes, we make life miserable for them, we punish them, we grind them down, and they go out and commit more crimes.
And maybe some of these crimes are things that shouldn't be crimes, like
Absolutely.
drug-related.
Absolutely. But even the violent criminals, you look at Norway, one of the most secular countries in the world with more atheists and agnostics than theists, that they use rehabilitation, and they have a 20% recidivism rate. So they're looking at what works, not some imaginary sense of things. So that's really
And not
important.
everybody can be rehabilitated,
punishment.
but there's some hope for that
Absolutely.
if we do it right. is what you're saying.
Absolutely. And we have to follow the data.
Yeah.
We can't just do that, absolutely.
So just briefly,
Yes.
when you kindly flew in here from California yesterday and met with some of our staff, and we had kind of a brainstorming session, you also proposed that maybe when we talk about morality, we should be using the word ethics.
Okay. Yeah.
So could you just elaborate?
So, my sense is that in everyday language, when we describe someone as moral or ethical, it kind of means the same thing. So morality, ethics, these things, they cover similar territory. But I often find that when we talk about moral, there's a little bit of a judgmental tone, a little bit of looking down one's nose, maybe, oh, that's immoral, as if it perhaps someone has, improper sexual relations, or someone is not, dotting their I's and crossing their P's and Q's or whatnot.
Moralistic.
Moralistic,
Yeah.
And I think of people like Mike Huckabee as moralizers. They're wagging their finger and saying, well, if everybody was as upstanding like me, we wouldn't have these problems. And there's something about ethical that I think has a bit more of a center to it, a bit more of a rational, reasonable approach to the world. What is ethical? How is treating people the way I would want to be treated? It's based on principles and precepts so I like to use that word ethical because, number one, the religious, I think, have, in a sense, destroyed the meaning of morality through their fantasies and fairy tales and phobias. And so we still have that sense of ethics and ethical, which I think implies a certain responsibility towards the world, a certain responsibility to see that justice is done, that fairness is done, that compassion and kindness guide our way of living. And so I like that term.
Because ethics implies, to me at least, it's the study of human behavior.
That's right.
Morality seems to be like, here's your commandments, here's your rules, just do what you're told.
I agree.
So really, in short, Phil, secularism could rescue our world.
I believe so. I believe it's one of the great hopes for human progress. Politically, we have to have that separation of church and state and government neutrality when it comes to religion because we're a diverse society. And no one religion should be dominating, and no one should ever have to pay their tax dollars to support religious beliefs that they don't believe in, right? But even culturally, secularism with its emphasis on empathy, ethical living, compassion, being in the here and now, it's the only way we're going to solve any problems. With its emphasis on empiricism, this is how we're going to face the struggles of global warming and gun violence, only through reason, only through rational policies, not through faith and prayer, right? And then just in our personal lives, secularism is empowering because it says that we are the masters of our own fate and we are not at the whim of deities and supernatural imps that are thwarting us at every turn. We have the power to make the best of our lives that we can in the here and now. And that's what secularism to me offers the world.
Well, hear, hear.
Exactly.
We are out of time. You are our secular guru, and your books and research have done so much to bring real data and facts to this whole story of religion versus non-religion and what is
Well, I really
useful for
appreciate
society. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, and thanks for the work you do. It's inspirational.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.